My name is Jeremy French. I'm the director at Making Whole, and you're watching A Student's Perspective.
Hi there, and thanks for tuning in to A Student's Perspective, the weekly series that connects students with designers, manufacturers, educators, industry professionals, and design media celebrities to hear their stories on just how they've gotten to where they are now. Through our conversations, we connect the past, present, and future of design to show just how much we can learn from each other to grow towards our fullest potential without prescribed limitations. Think of A Student's Perspective as a weekly design lecture series from the student's point of view. A Student's Perspective is a division of the nonprofit University Hall of Innovation, whose goals are to connect students with the design industry through design challenges and mentorship, and a collaboration with the Marywood University Interior Architecture Program in Scranton, Pennsylvania. All interviews can be found in their video format at www.astudentsperspective.tv. For more information or sponsorship inquiries, please contact universityhallofinnovation@gmail.com.
Hi everyone, I'm Courtney.
And I'm Maia.
And this is a new episode of A Student's Perspective. Today we are here with Jeremy French, the director of Making Whole at COHAB Space. Jeremy, thank you so much for taking some time to sit with us and have a conversation. Can you just give a little introduction of yourself and maybe your background leading up?
So I'm the director of an apprenticeship program for recovering drug addicts, and we teach them how to build furniture. And so my background is in architectural concrete and not doing drugs. And so those two things are what bore this.
Okay, so with that being said, can you just give a little story as to how maybe your own individual story developed, and really more specifically, leading up to how you got
This is a long conversation. Let's hear from Maia first.
I was basically going to ask the same thing.
You can't sit here quietly. I'm not letting you off the hook.
Oh, thanks. Well, yeah, I'm really excited to hear what Making Whole is for those who don't really know.
So there's a lot of different directions we can have this conversation in, because it's not just about furniture, it's about people. And so my background getting here, there's certainly a storyline that follows design and building. And then there's a storyline that follows life. And at some point, what Making Whole is the merger of that in my own personal life, which also reflects the bigger picture that I have about what design is and what building things is. And so there's a lot of ways to begin this conversation, and I suppose the way that's probably the most appropriate is to say that I need professionally to be challenged with complicated problems. And as problems become less complicated, I become less interested. And so I'd been working with concrete, which is a really complicated problem, for a long time. And it had gotten to a point where it wasn't complicated. And so as I was considering what comes next in my life, what is becoming an increasingly complicated conversation is what to do with all the people who are dying from addiction. And some of the people that I'm closest with in my life have passed away, and I spent some time saying, what's the solution to this? And I don't know that anybody has a really direct solution. And so this sort of exploration of that question had me asking questions about what's my experience, who do I know that's gotten better, and what was their storyline. And a couple of things that came up for me, guys came back to me every year who'd worked in my shop and told me, working in your shops will change my life. The spirit, the problem solving, the sense of community, the sense of purpose. So that was one thing that happened. And then the other thing that happened is I consider people who I've known who have gotten better from addiction and who have developed lives that I would trade for. One of the common denominators in all of their lives is that they either had a profession or a hobby that forced them to solve problems in a creative fashion. And so that included a lot of people in the maker space, but it included mothers who were engaged with motherhood in a way to where they were facing the work of being a mother in a way of well, how do I do this? And how do I find creative solutions to the problems that I'm having? Certain types of entrepreneurs who are in the same space of having to solve problems, complicated problems creatively. And so without exception, everybody that I look back on and say, I would take their lives right now in exchange for mine, which I'm comfortable in, all had that common denominator. And so to me, there's this curious thing that happens that was clearly either a byproduct of people getting better or the source of people getting better. And so part of this exercise is a bit of a science experiment to figure out which one is it.
Sure.
So
That's amazing. Can you talk like a little bit about how how did you get into furniture? Like what about furniture is
So my first, partly, when I got sober when I was 17 and I dropped out of high school, and so I was in the professional world and I just got fired from all my jobs. And the reason why is because I was arrogant and unemployed. And so the only person that would employ me was me. And so I started my own business. And so it's important to come into that angle because a lot of people would say, oh man, you started your first business at 18. You must be so whatever. And the answer to that is like, I'm so unemployable that I'm the only guy that would hire me. And so that first business was in landscaping. And like everything, I'm a really curious person. And so everything, I'm really curious to find out why. And so why do we plant the plants we plant? And also, I'm really curious to consider my own personal tastes and experiences and figure out a way to incorporate that. And so I love the natural world. And so I had all these questions. I had a huge amount of like passion and commitment to the work. And one of the problems with landscaping is that really good design doesn't look like anything when it's done. And so when it's time to exchange money for what I've done, the people really don't know what they have. And so a lot of ideas, particularly in landscaping, and this will tie into conversations we can have later about people's understanding about what they're buying, is there's this moment in time where it's really when the money exchanges and when the sort of final handshake exchanges is, do people understand what they have? Do people understand what it's going to become? And with landscaping, which is probably worse than anything else I've experienced in the design trade, people just don't know, right? And so what people want out of a landscape are like mature trees, and they want to plant things really close together. And what they effectively want is to have a feeling that if you provide them with that feeling, you've also produced a design that's a bad design, because in 3 years it's going to be overgrown. It's going to look like trash, right? And so that became really frustrating to me. And what I wanted was to have all this effort and input that I was putting into my professional life to have an impact on people, to where when that exchange was done, they understood more of what they had. And it was more of like, they can see like how much effort I put in. And part of this is me being young and needing that sort of affirmation that, wow, you've done a good job, you've done good work. And that was really important to me in my earlier years. And so I in the middle of a landscaping business, I found out about, I had always loved working with concrete, doing landscaping, and I read this book that was released in the early 2000s, and I said, I want to do this in my kitchen. And I told a friend, hey, I think I'm going to do concrete countertops in my kitchen. This is back when they were kind of unheard of. And he's like, well, I've got a client that would love that. Will you do it for him? And this was like an idea that I had, that I could do this. And I was like, of course I can do that. And I had no idea whether I could or not, but I got myself into like, a lot of where I've gotten myself into the position I'm in now is by saying yes, and then failing miserably, and to the point that I was finally able to produce something that was good. And so I'm unwilling to stop until it's good. And so my business in concrete really fed that need, because at the time there was no real information about the material and about how to utilize it in this sort of fashion. And so that a business grew out of that, doing architectural concrete starting in 2003. And then in 2011, I sold that business to a material supplier in that industry, and was able, at that point, to get the opportunity to go and supply materials to people in the trade around the world. And that invited me into their shops and into their lives and into their families. And one of the things about concrete is that it's really a brutal material to work with. It's really taxing. And so everybody that I was engaging with were faced with these like pretty complicated problems that affected them as humans, right? It's not like wood. There's a story about wood that's been around for centuries. Concrete, even though it's the only thing we consume more on the planet, is water as human beings. Cement is the second most consumed thing, but we don't understand it. And there's not a dialogue about it in the story that we do know about it. So people think it's bomb-proof because it's on a sidewalk. But it turns out it's not. It stains, it scratches, it does all these things. And so we don't have the benefit of a history where people expect wood to do things because their grandparents had it.
Right.
So in 2011, I sold this business and got to travel around the world and see other makers and see their spaces and engage with the problem on a larger level with more people and see the sort of how broad the problem was for individuals. And then eventually over time, solutions started popping up and it became something that enamored me less. And so at that point, I was consistently losing friends to overdose and suicide, and decided it was time to do something different. And so this idea of making whole was born out of a curiosity more than anything else. And it also was born out of a professional need to have a problem that was complicated enough to engage me.
Right. Yeah, so you went to talk about a little bit more about what design looked for you, and I guess with that problem that you saw throughout, your experience and others' experiences, how did that kind of morph to say, like, this is exactly what I need to do, like, this is my moment to kind of provide the solution for other people, like, kind of getting into the idea of the maker space, like, what challenges did you kind of go through that kind of progression of development?
Of making whole?
Yes.
That's a tough question to answer. So one of the things about I guess before answering that question, one of the curious things that's come up for me is considering how do tools get developed for people, whatever we're talking about, and how does the infrastructure for solving a problem develop over time? And so what I mean by that is how does the infrastructure for medicine exist today, and where did that come from? And how does the infrastructure for architecture and commerce and all these things? So like right now, we could all decide, I'm about to go travel to Europe and we need plugs, right? And so we can get on Amazon right now and buy a plug. And so how did that happen, right? How do we get to the point where, not that long ago, I didn't have an internet in my pocket. And when I needed to travel overseas for the first time, finding this plug was this huge production. And now we can literally, by the time I get home, there'll be a plug.
Yeah.
With medicine, like how can I have a medical condition and not know what it is and go to a place and have them diagnose that condition and treat that condition? With building, how can I just develop a building plan out of nothing? Where did that come from? And part of the reason why I'm asking that question is that when I consider the infrastructure around addiction, the question is like, where did that come from and why is that what we use? And so with addiction, it doesn't seem, we're using a medical model, and the reason for that is because 100 years ago when we were just trying to stab at what was going on, the most successful endeavor to treat addiction and alcoholism was AA, and they said, kind of in layman's term, this is a disease. And the reason why they used that language is because to layman it made sense, but it wasn't necessarily something where we like, oh, this is definitely, medically this is the reason why this is a disease. We just had a sense, right? And so that was a useful enough placeholder in the dialogue to stick. And so what happened was we started to develop better understanding of what's happening in our brains with addiction. And we started to consider whether this disease is the right language to use. At the same time, insurance is one of the main providers of resources to treat this problem. And so if we abandon this dialogue, then insurance has a backdoor to not provide coverage. So, and this is coming to something we'll get to. So we can't abandon this language.
Sure.
Insurance needs a framework to work around to be able to decide how to cover people. And so what we did is we adopted the medical model for treating people. So we took this machine that was built to solve one problem and tried to take that machine and solve another problem with it that's maybe not related. This is going to be curious. All right. So anyway, what I've decided is that this model is not necessarily like this infrastructure and this machine to solve this problem doesn't fit the problem. And so the question became, where does infrastructure and where do solutions come from? And so let's back it up to the point we're building a house 3,000 years ago. What was that experience like for somebody? And how do we go from that experience of having a local stonemason who comes from generations of stonemasons build your house? And what was that experience like for him? And how do we go from that to like this sort of embodied knowledge that's a generational knowledge, that's a local knowledge, and turn that into something where the three of us could decide, hey, let's build a strip mall in Indiana right now. And without ever setting foot in Indiana, and without ever setting foot in a factory, and without ever setting foot anywhere along the lines, we could have a conversation. We could produce specs. We could send those specs overseas. They could completely prefabricate this thing, send it back, develop it. We never have to touch it. How do we go from having to need this intimate local knowledge to creating this machine? And what's that process look like? And where do we start from? And so if we find that there's a tool that's not appropriate for a problem, where do we start? And so looking back on that, one of the things that strikes me is that where we began was with a level of intimacy with materials and with people and with conditions that we don't need today, right? You don't have to know what a stone tastes like in Ireland to build a house in Ireland.
Yeah.
But there was a time where they, like, one of the things you get woodworkers and they don't know what kind of wood something is, and the first thing every one of them does is licks it and smells it, right? And so it sounds absurd. You see some guy, you walk into our shop, one of the guys is licking wood, and you think, this dude's lost the plot, right? But he'll lick the wood and he'll tell you what it is.
Right. Wow.
And so that level of intimacy, one of the things with craftsmanship that's been lost is the need for that intimacy is not as pertinent as it was, right? And that's maybe a good thing, it's maybe a bad thing, it just is what it is. But as we consider the solution for addiction, if we haven't gone through the process to develop a tool, where do we start? And where we started with every other thing was with a level of intimacy, a level of understanding. And so to me, that's where we have to begin. We have to begin with intimacy, not just with the thing we're doing, which is trying to help people, but also with the problem. And what intimacy is just closeness, it's just consideration, it's just spending time with something and kind of letting it saturate you until you get to a point where you have an understanding of it. Then what happens is we get to the point where we can measure something, right? And I can say, this is wood, and I know it's this type of wood because of these measurements, and I can translate those measurements to you. Now you suddenly are able to adopt some aspect of the intimacy that I have. You're able to build a machine. That machine, which is reliant on the ability to communicate measurements, becomes the basis for a solution, right? And so one of the reasons why medicine's so good at solving so many problems is typically a problem that's a centralized problem that we can measure. So we can look at a tumor and we can measure its behavior. We can measure its size. We can measure how it acts against certain conditions. And then we can communicate that. We can build machines that do certain things in response to this measurement. Where we really struggle, and this is where this conversation becomes a design conversation, is when problems are decentralized and problems become sourced in different aspects of life, right? And so you can come up with, like, probably for college, you can be asked to do a certain thing and you can excel at it. Like, hey, design an interior for whatever. It doesn't translate to the rest of the world, because as soon as you take it outside the 3 parameters you've been given and add a 4th, the problem becomes exponential, right? And so we're not good at that. We're not good at solving problems where suddenly the inputs increase rapidly. And so with addiction, this is something that's has so many different aspects that affect all of us, physically, and mentally, and emotionally, spiritually, that we don't know how to treat it. And so it also applies to a lot of design, is that what are we building for? We're building for economics, we're building for culture, we're building for humans, we're building for our own personal needs fit into that somewhere, our own egos fit into that somewhere, and it becomes such a complicated conversation that we kind of fry a little bit. So in response to that, we don't have tools to answer these questions. What I want to do is go back to the beginning, where it's intimate, until the intimacy allows us to have a conversation about how to measure the problem and about how to measure the solutions and our responses to those problems in a way to where eventually tools can get built. Wow, that was a fucking tangent.
No, that's really cool that you're able to, like, figure out from the beginning, you find that source of intimacy, and how, like, maybe that person can then create a relationship with what they're doing and, like, really, like, draw from that, rather than how you said, like, machines, you don't create a relationship with that because it's so quick, but, like, you spend the time with that and, like, you get to know it in a sense. Is
Right.
that what you see with your, like, clients who come in with the furniture?
Well, with humans, right? That's an intimate thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're open to the intimacy, it's going to be there. You know, everybody's craving that. In design, it's a curious thing, and we had an architecture firm at our shop recently, and we got into a dialogue about the gap between why we do this work, which is often born out of intimacy and born out of a personal feeling, and then what we actually do, which is servicing people that maybe don't really understand what they're getting.
Yeah.
You know, and so an example of that is that, like, I've yet to meet an architect that doesn't like texture and life and patina. And I've yet to meet a client that understands what that means, right? And so you give them, these are leather tops right here, and we're gonna give this to a client, and the client's gonna be like, I love patina, and I just can't wait for this to be old and look like my boots. And the first ring is gonna make them lose their minds. They're gonna lose their mind. And so, you know, when you're considering being an architect, and your job and your livelihood is dependent on making people happy, and you know that they don't know what patina is, then you start creating something that's maybe divergent from why you got into the business in the first place, which is about life, and it's about intimacy, and it's about this like deep instinct that you have to create space for people. You have to diverge from that in response to, well, I've got to make a living. And so I've got to create something that somebody understands, to where when the financial exchange happens, they're not like, well, I'm going to withhold 10% because of this ring on my, they don't want to do that, right? And so the more developed people get in the design world, the more safe they become, because at the end of the day, this is a business. And the risk of being creative is actually very high. And so there's certain people that get there to the point where they're like, I can do whatever I want because my name justifies that. But for a lot of people, it's like, I need to do what's safe because I got a family at home. I don't want to work all the time. I don't want to get that call from the client. They text you and they're like, oh my God, this is terrible. And you're like, that gut feeling of like, oh, I've failed and I'm not going to get paid. And they're going to tell everybody what a terrible person I am. And so the safety is born as a result of that. And what we lose and what we diverge from is why we got into this in the first place, which is like this sort of innate instinct that there's life in here. And that's what I want to pursue. And so you go to college, you're like, what do I want to do? And I think a lot of the people that end up in the design trade have this instinct that I want to go follow life, you know? And so since there's not a job where I just get paid to travel around and fuss off and drink coffee in cafes, although there probably is when there's not, you know, the college curriculum doesn't give you that opportunity. It's like, where can I go discover life, right? And so there's this sense that there's that opportunity in the creative space. And then you get into the creative space and you realize, like, wow, that opportunity, I have to diverge from that. That's a real conflict. It was certainly a conflict for me, particularly in my younger years, where it made me angry that people couldn't appreciate that. And eventually I was like, well, I can fight human instinct, or I can figure out a way to try to like bring intimacy into my work in a way that doesn't interfere with my ability to make a living.
Wow. I think something that's like really interesting to me is like when you talk about intimacy with like, you know, others as well, like kind of that exchange that you keep bringing up is like that final moment. But I think for me, it's like kind of just eye-opening to see like the intimacy between those that come into the makerspace to kind of be involved in this program, and then, you know, gaining all of the opportunity that's from, you know, developing that product that they're looking for, kind of going through the stages to like become more self-aware and kind of go through everything that they need to, you know, not only find this product as a solution for, you know, whatever issue that they're having, but it's more of just like a personal connection to it. And that's the intimacy that I find is just so fantastic about the idea of this program, because I think not as many people realize how directly it's just so inspiring just to see that design can be that solution for like so many problems, but that is that centralized idea of how you guys made it to be.
Right. And so when I consider, like, design became a much broader idea to me.
Right.
At some point when I realized this applies to everything, right? This applies to relationships, like how I consider it. And so what is design and what is creativity? And there's this idea that it's this sort of like magical thing, right? Like, oh, you're so creative. Right, I've heard that all the time. Oh, you're so creative, and I'm not creative. I'm not creative at all, right? And really, what they're thinking about is like art class, where they were asked to paint something and they were trash at it, right? And so they think, well, I'm not creative.
Right.
That's too bad, right? But when I consider what is design, what is creativity, I struggle to draw the line between that and the scientific process. We've got a problem. You know, what is that problem? What are some potential solutions to that problem? Okay, let's try and make that. Now that it's made, does it solve the problem, right? And I think where creativity maybe differs from science is that there's a license for humanity in that process that kind of like doesn't work for the scientific process, right? Feelings get in the way of science, but feelings don't necessarily get in the way of creativity, right? And so when I consider design and creativity in the same light, is that I've got a problem. Now there's a process that I can follow to develop a solution to that problem that involves listening, and it involves theorizing, and it involves developing, and it involves like a conscious consideration of, did we solve the problem? Now it turns out that process is useful for anything. Like, wow, every time I'm in this situation, I feel like shit. Okay, that's a problem. Now let's develop a solution to that problem. Right, every time somebody new comes into the room, I feel uncomfortable in my own skin. What do I do about that, right? Or, wow, my family needs to eat dinner every night. What do we get? We don't have nowhere to eat. We're tired of eating on the floor. Okay, so like what a dining table should be, is a response to that problem, right? And so we have so many templates for what that solution is that we lose sight of, well, let's go back to the beginning and ask ourselves, what's the problem we're trying to solve, right? And so I prefer building things that get used in response to the problem we're trying to solve. So there's a lot of tables that we sell that go into somebody's room where nobody actually eats there. It's like a showroom, like, oh, look how pretty this dining table is. What's really interesting to me is to find out from a family, what does it mean for you to eat together? And one of the curious things that happens is you find out everybody eats dinner differently. Everybody's dinner experience is different, right? Everybody interfaces with that space and with that experience differently. And so rather than just saying, well, oh, okay, you need a dining table, pick one of these species of wood in the base, and that's your dining table, I'm really curious to find out, like, what's dinner mean for you? What do you like to eat, you know? I love Indian food. Turns out turmeric will stain anything, right? And so we give a nice, like, white oak dining table to an Indian family who eats lots of curry, and we're kind of begging for trouble. Now, white oak might match the design scheme, but I'd be really curious to find out, well, like, okay, this is what dinner means for this family. What are the implications of that experience? And is there a way we can design in response to that? That process is fascinating. Where it becomes especially fascinating is when you get to know people. And when they invite you to dinner, see, this is really the ploy here, is that like I get to eat with my clients and find out like, wow, this is great, you know, or wow, this food is horrible. We better make a beautiful dining table so they don't realize, you know, so at least something cool is happening in the room for dinner time. And so this sort of process of problem, listening to that problem, what does it mean? Like rewarding people for asking better questions in that process, so that we can really get a picture of the problem. And then like, okay, now what? Right? What do we do with that? And that to me is like, that's design. Design's not this magical, mythical thing. It's not about specific parameters. It's not about specs. It's not about any of that. We've got a problem, what's the solution? And the process for engaging that. And to me, like revelations and revolutions happen when people get really good at responding to that call and response. That's when you see things where you're like, holy cow, right? This thing is stunning, right? And you know that it's stunning visually, but you also get a sense that it's more important than that. And more often than not, you look at somebody that's like really considered the problem in a fashion that we never have, right? We still build things. Bathroom vanities, this changed in the last 20 years. Bathroom vanities used to be 32 inches tall, which is like at your knees, right? It's almost like a urinal / bathroom. And kitchen countertops were at 36. And so when you consider back, and y'all know this better than me, I'm a high school dropout, y'all went to school, but somewhere in the 50s, there's this whole thing of like how, and this is certainly a dude that did this, is like, how do we make women happier in the kitchen? Because we would really prefer that they kept cooking for us and doing this stuff. So there's like this sort of chauvinistic thing that drives dimensions in our kitchen. And so there's this whole thing they do in a museum or something like that, where it's like, look at the modern kitchen in this beautiful woman. And so this was all based on a woman that's 5'4" tall. And so it turned out we weren't designing kitchens for people that were tall. We were designing kitchens for people that were this dimension, right? And so now that's a spec, like how high are the countertops? 36 inches, right? And so we got cabinets 34 and a half, we got an 1.5 inch countertop. That's just what it is. Nobody asked the question. So as you start to consider, well, why? Why is it that way? and you discover that that's like the patriarchy actually built that for us, and maybe it's not the most comfortable thing, and then you suddenly make countertops for clients who are 6 foot tall at 38, and they're like, oh my God, this is the most amazing kitchen I've ever worked in. I can't even tell you what it is.
Yeah.
And my back pain went away.
Yeah.
My lower back always used to hurt when I cook, and now it's because you're not like bending over to this countertop that was designed for some subservient woman in the 50s.
Yeah.
You know, wow, what a revelation. You know, it sounds like such a big, such a small deal, but it's not.
Yeah.
And so where does that come from? Is the people who are saying why. You know, why is a dining table this way? Why is it chest level? Why is any of this stuff this way? So why is there an apron on the front of the countertop? I like to cross my legs. I fucking hate aprons. I hate them. They drive me mad. I'm like trying to cross my legs and look cool and be comfortable. And next thing I know, I'm like this. And I'm having a conversation with somebody over here. And so I'm like, why do I have to have an apron? And so we just start designing bases with pedestal bases. And then you hit the corner of them and they go, because it turns out engineering is part of this conversation too, and leverage and all these things. And so we start just exploring this. Like, can we make a table where it's actually, where, you know, it turns out I grew up in the South, and if you put your elbows on the table, it's like sinful. Mm-hmm. And it turns out, like, I'm tired at the end of the day. I don't want to be like this, you know? And so I do that in this corner, like, cuts off my circulation. And so then I end up watching TV, right? And so this chance for my Southern mother to have a family dinner, you know, she's like, oh, what do you do to become a family? Well, you have to have dinner every night. And I'm like busy trying to get in on the sofa because it's uncomfortable. I'm not like comfortable at the table. So we've built a lot of dining tables, like the one behind you is an example of this, in the dining table at our shop, where there's a bevel here. And suddenly your arm rests on this bevel. And this curious thing happens in our shop, is that we have a big family style meal every day, and people come visit. And there's these conversations that take place after lunch. And part of the reason why is for no other reason than the fact that people are comfortable sitting at this table. Mm-hmm. Is that they can kind of like, you know, position their bodies, and there's this like invitation to like slouch and be real and be honest. And like the environment that creates intimacy. Like, what a crazy idea that a bevel would create intimacy with the people at dinner. But it turns out that's the power of design, is that you actually get to create a space. And that doesn't just mean something that looks cool in fucking Decor magazine. Yeah. It means that it creates an opportunity for life, right? And that's what's interesting to me. It's like we get to create an opportunity for life. And in the case of this project, that life is not just in space, but it's also with human beings. And like that's interesting. And so what questions are born out of this, you know? What questions do we get to get when we see that a piece of dining table, the way a dining table is designed actually impacts the way somebody interfaces with their mom, right? We've sat down with men and their mothers at this dining table, which is typically like a really difficult thing to do, especially if the men have been fuck-ups their whole life and were in prison 6 months ago. Yeah. And mom's sitting there and she's like horrified, doesn't know how to act. And when you watch them, like, you know, it takes 30 minutes for us to even get to the point where we're going to have an honest conversation, because everybody's deciding whether, you know, is this about to be a battle? Are we about to tell lies to one another? And then people physically relax, and then these conversations go to places where you would never expect them to go.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Wow.
I guess, is that the basis for the foundation valuistically for Makerspace? Like, is that what you kind of bring in everybody with and kind of, you know, sit down and say, you know, this is kind of the issue or the solution that we're trying to fix. I'm going to try to implement maybe some of these values that you've talked about into that program.
Yeah. I mean, I think so.
Okay.
The value of, like, look, I want people, one of the things that we're not talking about is intimacy. Mm-hmm. Before we become intimate, we suffer. Mm-hmm. And so another thing, and this is like a curious thing, is that like furniture is beautiful now, and it's like you see these things on Instagram or you see them in the magazines, and you're like, wow, that's perfect. And you think to yourself as a maker, like, well, they're perfect. Right. And the truth of the matter is that intimacy requires suffering, and we're in this pursuit to like abandon suffering. And it turns out like that's one of the key elements to the human experience. And so this process requires failure, and it requires suffering, it requires discomfort to get to a point. And so that's one of the things we talk about, is that what is failure, and what is discomfort, what is suffering, and how do you exist in that? And so there's not a lot of opportunities for people to be in controlled suffering and to get to have the experience of what that feels like and how to persevere through that. And so sometimes that's kind of in response to your question. Sometimes we explain that to guys, but sometimes we don't. We just put them in a situation where we know for sure they're going to suffer.
Right.
And then we just stand back and let that process take place. And they don't know what's happening. They just think the place sucks. And then over time, we like hold them through that process. And eventually, like usually, it's darkest before the dawn. Usually, like right at the darkest moment, the thing happens and the piece comes out well. And they, oh my God, this was totally worth the experience of suffering the way I did. And now I've got muscle memory on how to do that. And I'm going to try that again. Right.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that's really cool that you're able to like make that connection between like going through all that, the process of making a piece of furniture and the suffering set and failure, and like do you notice a lot of like reflection on how they can take control in their life and like solve those
It's all the same
problems?
story.
Yeah.
100%. Like, so part of that is about learning how to experience suffering and not be afraid of it. Part of that's the invitation. Like, one of the reasons why I didn't do well in the educational system is that it was like kind of a black or white thing. Like you succeeded or you failed, and there's this instinct in me that that's bullshit.
Yeah.
Right? And so one of the things it did in the time that I was in the educational system is it developed a sense of fear around failure. Like this is bad, right? If I come home with a report card that says failed, like I'm gonna probably like have to do things that I don't want to do.
Yeah.
And then people don't realize, though, I think, too, is that, like, by failing, you're learning something. It's like, okay, so maybe I don't like that, or maybe I wasn't good at it, and maybe it's something that you just don't like, and that's it.
Yeah.
You just
Right.
move on. But now it's, like, taking that failure and then moving on and figuring out what you want to do or what you like.
Like
you know?
using that failure
Exactly.
to help drive
It's
the
a
direction.
powerful tool. And it turns out you're never going to hear a story about somebody who's successful where the story is not actually about failure.
Exactly.
Right? My son says to me the other day, look, I read The Lord of the Rings, and it's like, Lord of the Flies, right? He's like, this book's like 9 chapters, it's like 145 pages long, and it's like, the first 100 pages are just like talking. And then it's like, finally the thing actually happened at the end. I was like, that's actually how stories work, right?
Yeah.
Like we develop the story, we get a sense of the story, and then like the point comes across. Well, it turns out success stories are like a story about failure, and then the last, like finally, we had to talk about failure. Like this is a story about success. We had to talk about failure for 100 pages.
Yeah.
Trash, Well, that's the story of success. It's like we fail and we figure out a different way to interface and engage with where the failure comes from. So it turns out it's our best teacher. Like, oh, I did this thing and it didn't work. One of the nice things about when we deal in furniture is we're dealing with objective mediums, right? Somebody fails, like I say, hey, cut something 48 inches long. They that's a thing, right? And so it comes back and it's 47 inches long. Now we can have a dialogue that's not necessarily an indictment on somebody's character, right? It either worked or it didn't. And that objectivity really opens the door for conversations that you might not otherwise be able to have. Because if we start talking about things that are more closely tied to our value, like the way we interact with people or the way we engage with problems, then there's so much value attached to that it's difficult to have an honest conversation about something where we're scared we're not good enough people as a result of that. Right? And so, like, it's one thing to be like, oh, you missed this math problem. You're like, oh, yeah, I did. And, like, you're going to have feelings about that because you don't want to fail, but it's, like, your value. But, like, you design a house and bring that to, Steven or somebody who's like, this is wrong. And you can be, like, devastated. Right? Because what you hear is, like, I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And it, like, freezes you. And now, one of the unfortunate things that happens as a result of that is you're like, I don't want to feel that again.
Yeah.
That sucks. And so next time I'm going to design a house for Steven.
Right.
Right? And maybe there's some value in that because you got to learn who Steven is and you got to figure out what Steven likes. But the other thing is that there's this departure away from what's authentic about you, which is unfortunate. And the reason why there's that departure is not necessarily in an exercise to get somewhere, but it's in response to like, oh, I don't want to feel that way again.
Yeah.
Right? And so to say, hey, I'm sure Steven's not a terrible guy like that. I'm sure he's going to be a little bit more fair to you in his critique of your work, right? But the hope is like this failed and that's okay. It's not actually an indictment on who you are.
Yeah.
It's just like you missed the mark on your problem, and the reason why is obvious because we understand the problem, right? And the reason why you missed the mark is because you didn't respond to the problem in an appropriate fashion. And so why? What do we do with that?
Yeah. So my next question was, pretty much kind of, I could see where it was definitely answered through all of your conversation thus far. But I guess, going off of the idea that, makerspace is the sustainable solution for, addiction, or for the process of getting through that problem that they're challenged with. But why do you feel like it is the sustainable solution? Like maybe
we don't know the solution.
Yeah.
This is the hypothesis.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
The intimacy and connection and purpose and controlled failures and controlled suffering, that there's value in that.
Yeah.
And so why do we know there's value in that? Is we consider, this is a traditional apprenticeship, rather than being like community college where we're going to come and learn how to do dovetails. This is more the traditional apprenticeship. We're going to follow guys that have done this before. And you need to be on their shoulder, and you need to be ready to go sweep the floor or grab a tool or actually do the work yourself. That traditional apprenticeship work, before we developed the infrastructure that we were talking about earlier, that's where intimacy was, and that's where things got translated. And so the master begins to translate this to the apprentice, right? And eventually in that process, we start to develop measurements because there's that communication. It's not just one person holding the intelligence, right? And so that was a useful thing. Well, it become less useful, right? Having masters of everything is not so useful when you've got a CNC that can do one thing, and you've got somebody that's really good at a certain problem that can do one thing. We decentralized the solution. Whereas before, historically, the solution needed to come from one place, right? And so that traditional craftsmanship, there's not a demand for it for that reason, right? But when I consider, okay, we're going back to the beginning of the story, who were the guides at the beginning of the story? Were these master craftsmen, and they had apprentices, and that was the interface. And so we know that model works in getting people beyond a certain point. And the question is, does that work with addiction? And there's I'm not going to say proof, because we're a long way from getting scientific about this, but there's evidence that would suggest that there's value in that. And so at this point, being able to say we're offering values enough to consider continue the experiment, right? Absolutely. Fair enough. Yeah. But I'm not so bold as to say that this is the solution. One of the things it's not is that intimacy is not scalable, right? We've got 100,000 people a year dying of overdoses in this country. Having a 10-person apprenticeship program is not a solution to that problem. It's too broad, right? But because nobody really does have a solution, certainly exploring and doing these sort of science experiments of what works and can we have a better dialogue about it, certainly not hurt the cause.
No, not at all. Especially when you start that conversation of having multiple little kind of intimate moments that this program offers, and then kind of expand it. You know what I mean? So that small scale kind of action can definitely ripple and cause maybe longer down the line a potential solution for something.
Right. And that's the goal.
Exactly.
Right? We're not trying to save the world, but we are trying to ask better questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it.
Set that foundation for
and kind of start planting seeds in guys to where they begin to say, well, maybe this suffering is not so difficult that I can't live through it,
Right.
And not respond to that suffering instinctually in ways that are damaging.
Yeah.
So I guess just a final question would be that if you can go back to your younger self and really kind of take what you know now, what would you say? What advice would you offer, people, students, struggling, not struggling, just overall across the board with the knowledge that you've kind of prepared through this program, through your experiences?
I think that the thing that probably I would have valued, that would have impacted my life the most, is if somebody had told me to ask better questions when I was in my earlier years. Is if I'd learned to ask better questions, right? And so much of my inquiry and my motives was about changing how I felt, right? In an age where my body's changing, my brain's changing, and I've got this social input, and I'm being, I've got the pressures of performing, right? That pressure was so much that my response is this feels overwhelming. I don't actually know who I am or what I want to do, but I feel like I have to. All that early life pressure is if I'd have been focused on just asking better questions, why? And doing that in a way that wasn't an assault, but actually an inquiry, actual curiosity, I think I would have benefited from that a lot. And that's actually like that's what I'm curious about now in my own life. It's like asking better questions, not being so, not being quite as invested in the outcomes and more invested in the curiosity in the process to get somewhere.
Right. Yeah, great. I think that's, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that, you know, everybody here can definitely use and take forward.
You're never going to interface with somebody that was like, I mean, I just really hated that you ask good questions.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever going to be like, this person's questions, No, and it turns out like we all want to be asked better questions.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to be engaged in that fashion, you know. And we like one of the things it does is that it removes the stagnancy from the process, right? It's like so much of like what we do professionally becomes this repetition, and finding ways for it to be fresh and new is actually like vital if you're gonna have longevity in any profession. You know, one of the ways to do that is to be curious and ask different questions. Like, why? It's like probably the most powerful question. Like we kind of like beat that out of 2-year-olds, but they're kind of telling us like why, and you're like, oh, you know, because whatever. You know, why? And eventually like, shut up and eat your peas, you know? I don't want to answer. And what's interesting is like, it makes us uncomfortable, but it's like, wow, this kid's actually asking better questions than everybody in college. Why? Why is the sky blue? Fuck, I don't know. But it's a really interesting question. Let's go find out. Like, why is the sky blue? And as opposed to it being this like, insult that a 2-year-old's asking you things that you don't have an answer to, it's like an invitation to like,
Let's go explore.
wow, let's go explore. Why is a dining table the height that it is? You know, why is a dining table the shape that it is? Why is anything the way it is? Why are lights the way they are? Why? You know, and at some point, it's like when you get annoyed with the question, that's where shit gets real.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if you can switch at that point and be like, well, let's find out. Let's find out why countertops are 36 inches tall. And then you discover this whole like invitation to explore the patriarchy of America.
Yeah.
What? Nuts.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I feel like this was such an imperative conversation to have, and I definitely think everybody at home is going to enjoy it. So,
All right.
But
cheers.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so this has been a great episode of A Student's Perspective. Catch us next week as the conversation continues.